We all have storms in our lives that cleanse, clear, and convert the aftermath into a rainbow. If you have the right attitude, you can grow and weather the storm. Let's talk about it now over Lunch with Stormy.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to season 2 of Lunch with Stormy. And here we are right in the middle of a campaign season. So I'm super excited to introduce the Liberty editions for my lunches. The election is November 3rd, and it will be unprecedented in so many ways. Never before has our country been so tangled. And some of these knots include COVID, which has affected every single human. We have 2 political parties who should work together in concept, but they're really not working well together now. We're amidst the most heated constituent presidential election in our history, and we're showing hatred towards our neighbors dependent on if they have a D or an R next to their name. We have friends that are unfriending friends on Facebook by the dozens, and many of us will be voting by mail for the first time, so we have no idea what that means. It's unprecedented. But even so, elections are far more than presidential politics. You have your zip code, your mayor, your city council, your school board, governor, and these are the people that will actually directly affect and influence your everyday life, like where you live for you as an individual, your family, your community, and that's at your local and state level. Also unprecedented is I am a candidate in one of these races. I'm running for a seat in Utah for House District 21, which is in Tooele County where I live. I'm a first-time campaigner, and this process has been so fascinating that I want to talk about it this season. And that's why I created Liberty Lunch. So I could introduce people who know what it means to throw their hat into the ring of politics, even when they're not politicians. And this season, we will cover it all. We'll be talking to people currently in office, strategists, people running for re-election, those that have started PACs, all sorts of it. But they're really people that generate headlines and the people that run everything behind those headlines. So let's get to it. As you know, Lunch with Stormy has been about people who transform themselves, and it's become sort of a theme of the podcast. And today's guest, Sarah Riggs Amico, is an example of someone who has been on a continuous path of transformation. She's originally from Joplin, Missouri. She graduated Washington and Lee University and then earned her MBA from Harvard Business School. And after graduating Harvard, she took this job in the mailroom at William Morris Agency in New York, from Harvard to the mailroom. And then she moved to Los Angeles, where she became the youngest department head ever at another agency. And eventually she went to Georgia, where her family trucking business resides. And she became executive chairperson of that. Eventually, she was recruited to run for office. And her politics, the entry level into politics is this: the Democratic candidate for lieutenant governor of Georgia. She didn't start at some small level, she went for it. And she was running alongside the amazing Stacey Abrams. So with that, let's dig into lunch with the ferociously intelligent, and you'll soon learn empathetic, Sarah Riggs Amico. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Stormy. Oh my gosh, what an honor to be here. And with an introduction like that, I feel like I should talk less and let you introduce me more.
Well, you earned every breath of it, that's for sure. And I think we barely scratched the surface of, what you've done, let alone who you are as a person. But before we dig into everything, I wanted, the hot topic is COVID. You and your family all have recently recovered from it. And I just wanted to ask for our listeners and people who are curious, how was that? How were you? And for your entire family to get it, it's just so scary.
Thank you. I appreciate you asking. It was scary. I am young-ish. I'm 41 years old, healthy. My husband is 5 years older than I am. My parents are 65 and 66. And it was a real shock to the system, how sick we got and how quickly it came on. So I had symptoms for a few days right after our primary election in June. And by the time I went to the doctor, I probably scheduled my COVID test around 11 a.m. And by 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when I got there, I could barely stand up. And I ended up having symptoms for about 7.5 weeks. And, I was very fortunate in the sense that I wasn't hospitalized. I did not require oxygen. I recovered. And I think the worst part of it for me was that by the time we figured out I didn't have just a sinus headache, I had already given it to my parents, my husband, and our daughters, who were 7 and 9. And that was probably the worst part. It's a tricky virus, right? In the sense that I spent 3 or 4 days thinking I just had a headache or I was tired, and then thought I had food poisoning. And it wasn't until almost a week in that I got a fever, that I started coughing. And it wasn't for probably 3 weeks that I started. I think I was about 3.5 weeks in when I started coughing up blood. So, the illness is very tricky in the sense that it ebbs and flows. I remember right before we had the really scary coughing up blood incident, I thought, wow, 3 weeks in, I'm finally getting better. And literally the next morning that happened. 5 weeks in, I thought I was pretty much completely recovered. And then I had lost my sense of taste early on and got it back, thankfully. But about 5.5 weeks in, I developed something called phantosmia, where you have phantom smells. So everything,
oh my gosh, I've never heard of that.
No matter where I was sitting, smelled like somebody was smoking a cigarette next to me or burning tires, just kind of this acrid, really pungent smell. And, and to this day, my husband and I talk about how sometimes we are just tired. I mean, we're also working parents who are homeschooling a 2nd and a 4th grader right now,
Right.
dealing with a global pandemic in an election year that I think will be one for the history books. So there are a lot of things to be tired about, but there's no question that while fortunately the vast majority of people survive this illness, and in fact, many are asymptomatic, we still know very little about the long-term side effects. And I think that's something that we're going to be discovering over the next year. And it's been surprising to me how long it took to really get back up to, 100%.
Well, I'm glad you are back to 100%. How do you feel that the president has handled this rollout now, having gotten it and recovered from it? How do you feel this has gone for the country?
Not well. Over 200,000 Americans have died. And the reality is I got sick in the middle of June, which was long before the president, I think, showed up wearing a mask, which he still really doesn't do. I mean, this week, right. Brian Kemp, our governor, hosted a rally in Forsyth County, Georgia, with Eric Trump, the president's son. 0 social distancing, almost no masks. Certainly the speakers weren't wearing them. And, not 50 minutes later, the governor signed an executive order mandating or encouraging masks and restricting group gatherings to no more than 50 people. So I think the stunning hypocrisy of the GOP has really been on display. This didn't have to be this way. If people had been wearing masks when I got sick, I may not have gotten COVID. I may not have had to watch my 7-year-old daughter lay in bed for 3 days and cry that everything hurt. I may not still 3 months later be taking my 9-year-old daughter to the doctor and trying to figure out if she has lingering symptoms. It is tragic what's happened. There are 5 million cases globally of COVID, a little more than 5 million. 1 out of every 5 of those are here in the United States. We have about 4%, just under 5% of the world's population, and more than 22% of the world's COVID cases. So you don't have to trust my opinion or my politics. It's just math. The response has been abysmal, and shame on the president, who we now know, thanks to the Bob Woodward tapes, as early as February 7th, in his own words, admitted that this illness was 5 times deadlier than the flu, that it was transmitted by respiratory droplets through the air. And as I understand it, in other tapes, also discussed asymptomatic transmission, which, as you know, our asterisk governor, Brian Kemp here in Georgia, declared late in March, early April, that he had just learned this revelation that it could spread asymptomatically, which is insane.
That's insane.
Yeah,
That's been out for a
President Trump
minute.
knew, he did nothing, and it cost thousands and thousands of American lives. It's an absolute tragedy.
What do you say to people, the other side of that, those that say, I don't want the governor or our government to dictate whether or not I have to wear a mask on my face and it infringes on my freedom?
Look, there are many infringements on your freedom. You may not drive a tank to the carpool line to drop off your children at school. You are not allowed to shout fire in a crowded theater. And, you're not allowed to drive around drinking and without a seatbelt. We have uninsured, right? We have all of these restrictions in place to protect public health and safety. And this is no different. So I was particularly disturbed this week to see the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, say that he thought this was the greatest infringement, mask wearing, right? Like, we're not talking about asking you to donate a kidney or chop off a limb. We are literally talking about wearing a mask to protect yourself and your community, not to mention your family. And Mike Pompeo said this is the greatest infringement on personal liberty since slavery. Now, as somebody who resides in the Old South and knows countless families and children of families who lived through the Jim Crow era in the South, as somebody who has witnessed continued systemic racism today and voter suppression today in my own state, how dare he? How dare he?
I think that's a pretty bold statement he made when you've got the backup like you do. So you've got this amazing story, right? You were born in Missouri and you grew up there, right?
I did, in the Ozarks down in Joplin. I was born in St. Louis, but grew up in one high school town in the southwest corner of Missouri.
I love that. Such a small little place. And then your dad was a Harvard guy. Is that right?
Yes, a miracle though. My dad was the first in his family to go to college. And the reason he got to go to college is my grandfather was working in maintenance in a General Motors factory. And he noticed some young kids walking around with short sleeve white shirts and ties. And he asked a coworker, who are these kids with the shirts and ties? And they said, well, those are the GMI students. And he said, well, what is GMI? So that's the General Motors Institute. And what it was a program that General Motors put together where you could work for 6 weeks and then go to college for 6 weeks and pay your way through school, working in a General Motors factory. And that is how my dad went to college. He would move back and forth between St. Louis and Flint, Michigan every 6 weeks to pay his way through school. And it was a great program. In fact, the current and first female chairman and CEO ever of General Motors, Mary Barra, is also a GMI graduate. Today, the university is called Kettering University, and it continues to be a work-study co-op program. We've given a lot of scholarships to the school, actually, heavily invested in what we think is one of the most wonderful programs in the country, a great reputation for engineering and management. So yes, that is how my dad went to college.
Isn't that the greatest? I love that story.
It's amazing. And it's a model I wish we had more of. If you think about it, the kids graduated, right, with as much work experience as they had school experience. So they went on to be some really remarkable executives. And he had a friend from GMI who literally flew from Boston to St. Louis and gave my dad an application to the Harvard Business School. And my dad said, I don't know. It was pretty amazing. I went to college and he said, I'm not leaving until you fill this application out. And he didn't. So my dad filled it out and was shocked to get in. And when he went to tell his boss in a plant he was working in, he'd gotten into business school. I don't think he meant it anyway, but he said, basically, we don't need Harvard MBAs running the plant, and that's all you're ever going to do. So we can't help you. So my dad resigned, flew to Boston, slept on a friend's couch. My mom stayed behind and sold their furniture so she could buy an airplane ticket. And they had no idea how they were going to pay for this, but he knew it was the chance of a lifetime for a kid who grew up pretty poor in St. Louis. And apparently a high-level executive at the company had heard the story about how the plant manager talked to my dad and flew to Boston, took him out to dinner, said, I've heard this story. Is it true? My dad said, yes, sir, and explained what happened. And they gave him a scholarship to go to business school.
Wow.
And that is how my parents literally afforded to live and work in Boston while my dad was going to graduate school. So when I talk about the power of education or the ability to live the American dream, it's deeply personal because my family lived it. You know, two of my grandparents worked as custodians, janitors, one at one point in his life, and then built his way up to being a machinist and a building inspector and ultimately a city manager. And my grandmother cleaned hospital rooms until I was in high school. And unfortunately she got Alzheimer's, so went into a nursing home. But, you know, we came from really humble beginnings. And I think that's the magic of this country. So yes, my dad went to Harvard, but I certainly wouldn't want folks to hear
Right. It's not like
some sort of dynastic. It's not.
Your lineage doesn't stem from there.
We came from really, really humble beginnings. And, you know, my grandma actually went back to college in her 60s, my dad's mom, because she could never afford it before then. And she studied accounting and sat for her CPA exam in her 60s. I mean, if I go back for any schooling in my 60s, I just want to tell your listeners, I'll be studying literature or art history, theology, something, you know, thought-provoking.
She went into accounting.
Yeah, she started work when she was 6 and retired just shy of her 80th birthday. So we come from a long line of people who know what hard work is.
So that's a true American dream story for your dad. There's no doubt about that. And then you get into Harvard. Right.
Yeah, I was 21, so it was a bit of a shock.
You get your MBA, and then you have this moment, you graduate and you're like, what am I going to do with my life? And so I heard a rumor that you were choosing between two things. One, being an FBI agent, and two, working in the mailroom at William Morris. And you chose the latter. How do you get there?
Yeah, it's funny. So after I graduated from business school, I did have, you know, $60,000 worth of student loans to pay off. So I took a job actually working in an entrepreneurial company for a CEO, basically to pay bills. It was a great experience, but I worked there for 2 years. And that's true. After 2 years, it was a software consulting firm, really nice people, really great clients, but I didn't have any passion for the space. And I kept thinking about the improbable odds of some girl from public high school in the Ozarks going to Harvard Business School and getting this chance. And I thought, what do I want to do with it? So I actually applied to 3 jobs. One was the William Morris mailroom for the agent trainee program. One was the FBI, and one was the State Department. And I got 2 offers at the State Department and turned them down, thinking that I would go to the FBI. So your rumor that you heard is accurate. And it's funny, I would have probably gone that direction, but they had not scheduled my interview. And it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks after they were supposed to schedule what they used to call phase 2 testing. I don't know what it is now, but it's kind of a big panel interview at the end of the process. And I hadn't heard back. And a woman who represented amazing writers and directors at William Morris, Spike Lee, Jeremy Pixar, who wrote Bulworth, Darren Star, who created Sex and the City, Steve Chbosky. I mean, she had just an incredible client list. She said, I'd love for you to be my assistant. And, you know, I had just turned
Those are good endings. Yeah. That's how I started at Overstock too.
Right. And I said, yes. And she said, well, there's a catch. And I'm like, oh, entertainment. Of course there's a catch. And she said, I need a 1-year commitment. And I thought, well, since I just turned down the U.S. State Department, not once, but twice.
I got a year.
I got a year. Yes. And literally 3 days after I accepted the job, the FBI special agent called to schedule my final round of testing. And
Any regrets on that?
No, I mean, I think God had a plan for my life and that timing wasn't coincidental. You know, I think they were surprised that I turned it down. And I said, look, if I give somebody a 1-year commitment and 3 days later I break it to come, you know, do the interview process, finish the interview process with you, I'm probably not the caliber of character you want to hire anyway. So no regrets, although it would have been, I'm sure, really meaningful work. it is funny that life took a different turn. So I ended up staying in media for almost a decade and had incredible experiences there.
It's incredible what stones you step on when you're walking freely. When you leave it open and you don't drill into a particular goal, which works for some and not for others. But when you're able to nimbly take that step and just go with it, it's amazing how life altering it can be.
Yeah. And my first boss at William Morris, the woman who convinced me to come work for her for a year, to this day is probably one of the best bosses I ever had. She really invested in me, not just as a professional, but as a human being. She was a woman of faith. She was Orthodox Jewish woman. And I grew up in the United Methodist Church and go to what a lot of people would probably consider non-denominational or even evangelical church today, although not the kind of white evangelicalism that we associate with politics, meaning just a non-denominational church that wants to share the gospel. And so we had that in common. And when I started working for her, she was probably 6 months pregnant. And I was a little bit older, right? I had already been to business school, had already worked for a couple of years as an executive. And she ended up having a medical emergency and being out of the office for a while. So I think it literally, in sort of God's timing, worked out, because instead of her having somebody that was maybe younger and less experienced, she had a Harvard MBA and executive who could step right in and help hold down the ship while she focused on her family. And to this day, when I think about how to balance work and kids and marriage and politics, I still think about the grace with which she did all of the above. So I'm very grateful.
Well, we definitely can welcome all women that, support each other and boost each other up and use their experiences to get that next woman to the next level. So after you do the William Morris thing, you go to Georgia where your family has a trucking company. So you leave the glamour, the entertainment, the celebrities. You were at a different agency at that point, not William Morris. But you move to Georgia and start running a trucking company. That is something, I love your pivots. Your pivots just make me go,
Yeah, it's a little bit like Walter Mitty, right? I mean,
yes,
you're really
it is.
living it.
Yes, it is like Walter Mitty. And you go do that for a while and you have some success there. And then you get recruited to step into a campaign. Mm-hmm. And how does that happen? They come knock on your door and say, we're looking for a lieutenant governor and we like you.
No, it's funny. So after the 2016 election, I was, like many Americans and especially American women and progressive women, gobsmacked. I was absolutely shocked that that we basically had, I think of like Hillary versus Trump as Hermione versus Voldemort, and like we elected Voldemort, right? Like we could have gotten the most qualified, experienced candidate at the time in history of presidential politics. And instead we got a reality game show host who bragged about sexual assault. So it was a really tough thing for me to sort of pick apart. And especially because, I'm not a lifelong Democrat. I had been somebody that had been a Republican, although I've always had a very progressive policy stance.
Hey, I have also been a Republican. I've been a Republican, a libertarian, and now I'm a Democrat. But I want to pause on that because I think people get stuck. Like I register as a Republican, so that's all I can be, or a Democrat. No, it's not all you can be. You can change it every 6 months.
And in fact, you should, right?
Yeah, like, you should.
When the Republicans ran Roy Moore for U.S. Senate in Alabama, everyone should have fled that ship, right? It's not a mystery that Doug Jones won that election. And certainly he had incredible support from women and volunteers, and in particular from Black women who for a long time have carried the banner of the Democratic Party, but have not always been given the positions of power they should have to go with that. Yes. So yes, you should change as your life changes. I mean, think about the things I've gone through in the last 15 years. I became a wife and to an immigrant. I became a mother to 2 little girls. I took a business that was collapsing and helped grow it from 120 employees to 3,000. I weathered the trade wars, the Great Recession, the collapse of the auto industry, which that's the freight that we move in our trucking company. I've, earned some gray hairs and some battle scars. And if that doesn't change your perspective, that's probably worth a little bit of introspection and reflection. For me, I think it enabled me to see, particularly around the issue of healthcare, why I had probably always been a Democrat without realizing it. I don't believe anybody should be sick because they're poor, or poor because they got sick. I mean, it's just basic. And watching Republicans spin their tires in the mud for years, trying to take away healthcare from poor folks, I didn't get it, and I never will. I think it was a deeply immoral thing for them to do. So, at that point, I had kind of become a Democrat. I would say 2014, I probably voted pretty much straight ticket Democrat. If I had to remember, that would be where I peg it. And I remember being excited because Michelle Nunn was running for Senate here and thinking, oh my gosh, we might actually have a female senator. We still haven't, by the way, nor will we this year. We can talk about that later. But so in 2016, I didn't know what I could do, but I knew that I hadn't left everything on the field for Hillary. And I wasn't going to make that mistake again. So I helped start an organization founded by a woman named Daniela Ballou-Ayres called the Leadership Now Project. And we were out to help reform democracy by putting together a coalition of business executives, CEOs, government officials, journalists, and academics, and looking for candidates who wanted to protect the institutions of democracy, who believed in facts and science, who believed diversity was an asset to nations and to businesses, to our economy. And so as we went through this process, I volunteered to be the person who helped recruit women to run for Congress. And about 5 minutes into the first call we had with the consultant who was helping, she interrupted. And I've learned that's normal in politics. And yeah, it totally is. And she says, well, I have a question. And I said, okay. She said, why aren't you running? And I was like, as what? As a, evangelical trucking company owning former Republican Democrat? Or do I run, I mean, I can't even imagine being a pro-marriage equality, pro-labor, pro-universal healthcare, pro-gun control, pro-choice, militantly pro-choice Republican, right? Like I didn't feel like I fit anywhere. And so I literally laughed. And when she said, why aren't you running? I said, because I'm not crazy. And that appears to be a prerequisite,
Doesn't it now? Yes.
Oh, I mean, think about it. And
Yes.
I mean that with love. Having now run twice, I'm fully aware of what I said. And she laughed and she said, no, I'm serious. And I said, so am I. I don't know where I fit, because I don't believe in demonizing other people if they disagree with me. But I believe in not mincing words when it comes to things like white supremacy and racism and structural inequality and everything from criminal justice to education to healthcare to economic opportunity. And I didn't know where I fit. And she said, let me call you back. And I thought, oh, I'll never hear from this woman again because I've probably terrified her. And sure enough, she called back maybe a day or two later and she said, look, Georgia needs a Democratic nominee for lieutenant governor, a candidate, a good candidate. And she said, there's this woman running for governor named Stacey Abrams. And man, I think you would really like her. And I went home, I did my homework. My mom actually knew who Stacey was. My mom's a romance writer. And
She had been in the House of Representatives in Georgia for quite some time. So hadn't she been in the House of Representatives in Georgia for quite some time?
She had, but I had been saving 3,000 jobs in a company that was, desperately trying to reach escape velocity.
Right. So your mom,
I didn't know
right.
her.
So she had been coming through as, an up and comer for a minute.
Yeah, she had. And when you meet her, you know exactly why, right? She's thoughtful, she's smart, she's compassionate, she's poised, and she's very savvy politically. But I literally, my mom, it was funny because I didn't know her, even being a complete political wonk. My mom knew her as a romance author. And I got a huge kick out of that. So I came home, I talked to my husband and I said, look, I got this call today. What do you think? And he kind of looked at me
Like,
and he said, well, yeah. And he said, look, whatever you decide, I'm here for you. And I've got the kids covered. I will help. I will drive you around the state. And candidly, I'd rather do all of that than watch you throw things at the TV for another 4 years.
Exactly. You complain yourself into running. I say that all the time now. I
Yeah, so
complained myself
I'm glad
here.
I did, right? I mean,
Yes,
it's the old Gretzky thing, right? You miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
that's right.
And even what I've learned is even when you don't win, you meaningfully change the landscape, right? When I started
Yes.
running for lieutenant governor in December of 2017, right? I started talking about the 79 Georgia counties without an OBGYN, not a single OBGYN, 79 counties, 64 counties without a pediatrician, 9 counties without a doctor. At
Ridiculous.
the time it was 7. It's gone up sadly. And people literally would ask me, where did you get those statistics? Because I don't think they believed it. And by the way, it came
Right.
from a state Senate committee report. And in the business world, as you know, we don't get to make up our statistics. Like we actually have to have facts. And so I started talking about this, and I talked about it all the way through the election and have ever since. And now even Republicans, when they talk about the state of healthcare, and in particular rural healthcare in Georgia, use those talking points. And, I talked a lot about labor and organizing rights, economic justice and security in the Senate campaign this year. And even though we didn't get the outcome we had hoped for, those very much became topics in the mainstream of the conversation. So for anybody out there thinking about running, you're qualified, you're ready, don't wait.
You are qualified. And that's a really good point, is that even by running, you can change the conversation. You don't have to win. So you and Stacy had great exposure, right? Oprah chimed in and supported and endorsed. And then President Obama comes in and
did a rally with us
and endorsed, right? Just amazing. And why do you think that was? Why do you think that they chose you guys to get behind?
Human nature is to look for the hope in any situation, I think. And I think what we represented was a different face, quite literally, right? There had never been 2 women at the top of the ticket. Stacy should have been the first Black woman to be governor in the history of this country. And we represented the kind of hopeful future that I think we all want to believe our kids can have. And I have to tell you, I probably became a Democrat, like a partisan Democrat, proud partisan Democrat, because of Barack Obama and particularly his leadership around the healthcare issue. And so to come full circle and be endorsed,
right, have his endorsement, my goodness.
Yeah. And get to meet him and, I got to speak at a rally with him. I mean, it just doesn't get any better. But it really made me hopeful. And I think it's tough because I'm a competitive person, but I feel differently about politics. I want to win, and I wish we had, but I don't look at it as a loss. We brought out hundreds of thousands of first-time voters in 2018 to Georgia, and that registration of new voters has continued after our election. So I think we showed people a sense of possibility and ignited in them, their imagination for what the future could look like if we don't.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No.
I wanted to hit on that voter thing, because voter suppression in Georgia is a thing.
It is. Well, it is everywhere in this country.
Well, and let's talk about what that means. Like, what does voter suppression mean?
Well, it means many things, right? We don't have a poll tax. We can talk about, in some respects, with things like felony voting rights restoration, why we actually do have modern day poll taxes or unpaid postage on mail-in ballots in the middle of a pandemic. We don't have people counting bubbles on a bar of soap, right? Or jelly beans in a jar. It's much more insidious and sneaky. And what I mean by that is, after the Shelby Supreme Court decision gutted the Voting Rights Act, what they call the formula for what they call pre-clearance, meaning any changes to your voting or election systems that could potentially harm historically disenfranchised voters, minorities predominantly, that you would have to get federal pre-clearance before you make those changes. And what the Shelby decision found was that the formula was unconstitutional, not the concept of pre-clearance, but the formula, and it threw it out. And so we've effectively had no pre-clearance since that Supreme Court decision. And as a result, over 1,100.
What does pre-clearance mean? in this
So
case?
literally, it means changes before you can change an election system or a voting system or aspects of it in a way that might detrimentally impact minority voters. You had to have the federal government give you pre-clearance to make those changes. They had to study whether or not it would harm historically disenfranchised voters. And when the Supreme Court, through the Shelby decision, got rid of that, you saw more than 1,100 polling places here in the South, 214 of those right here in Georgia closed before the 2018 election. You saw longer lines in predominantly Black voting precincts. You saw an inordinate number of absentee ballots rejected on things like signature match in minority and immigrant communities, where the names may have more unique spellings or may have accents that we don't see typically in a name like, Sarah Riggs or John Smith. And so we also saw in the case of Georgia in 2018, Brian Kemp, who was the Secretary of State, so the chief elections official in the state, overseeing his own election to the governor's mansion after he had purged over 1 million voters from the rolls here. Many
That's
of them,
crazy.
it's crazy. And a lot of them were purged because they had not voted in a couple of cycles, right?
That's not
But
okay.
your voting rights are not use it or lose it. They are constitutionally protected rights, and that should have never happened. So, voter suppression today looks different. There were missing power cords in these Atlanta, predominantly African-American precincts. That did not happen in lily white suburbs. We didn't see 7-hour voting lines in lily white suburbs. That's what voter suppression looks like in 2020, and it did in 2018.
That is, I know it's a lot in Georgia. I think it's probably happening in more states than people are aware of. So there's all these little niches that you learn about when you begin to campaign. I have a question, because you did go all over Georgia. You hit 150 counties, which is quite a bit in a short, campaigning period. What was the one thing that the constituents said, if there was one thing that was the biggest problem? Like, what was their biggest complaint?
Ooh, that's like asking somebody to pick a favorite child.
I know.
I like how you did that. You're putting me on the spot. So I'm going to give you a politician style answer and tell you the three things that I consistently heard. The first was how disenchanted they were with politics, right? That if you didn't have money, you didn't have influence. If you were not somebody who could give hundreds or thousands or, God help us, millions of dollars, like we see in these dark money PACs, if you were not somebody who could give that, they felt like your voice mattered less and less every year.
And what was the second?
The second one was how infrequently politicians came to their area and asked them what they needed. So what candidates tend to do, and I'm sure you've seen this running for office too, Stormy, they show up and they give you all of their prescriptions for how to fix all of their perceptions about what the problems in your community are. And what people really want is for you to show up and listen. They want to feel seen and heard and valued. Yes. And in order to do that, we need to talk less and listen more. And then the third thing I would say, I was really struck by how many communities felt like economic opportunity was dissipating right before their eyes, that the American dream would maybe be available to families that looked like mine, right? But that for Black and Brown communities, for rural communities, for poorer communities, the American dream has become almost mythology as opposed to something that we all aspire to. And that is something that has stayed with me ever since and fundamentally changed the way I see the world.
I bet. What now? I wonder if those three things may translate 50 times to every single state. Right? They sound like they might just be a blanket for our country, perhaps. What is the one thing that you thought, wow, we really do a good job of this? Everybody's so happy about. What was their big, like the thing that made them excited? Like, but I really love.
I think people are encouraged that there are still good people who want to run for office. I think authenticity is something that we know when we see it, even if we can't always describe it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think people understand and appreciate that there are people willing to take time away from their jobs, their families, their kids. I mean, I miss so many bedtimes driving
Yes.
around the state. And, a lot of times I took my kids with me too. My kids were sort of fixtures on the campaign trail, and we had a great time. I mean, they visited every corner of our state. But
Right. Well, yeah, that's got to be completely educational.
oh, it was great. Absolutely. But I do think people are encouraged that there are folks willing to step into the arena and fight for them. So, but to be honest, that's a very hard question to answer, Stormy. There's a lot of disenchantment out there.
Yes.
And it's really important to ask those kinds of questions because it focuses our attention on the rays of hope we see too.
That's right. So you ran with Stacy and you guys lost by 3%. It was really close. I wish
Not
you guys
even.
would have gotten that. Yeah, it was close. And then you went for Senate this year and unfortunately got stopped in the primary. But that's what I want to talk about. You also just mentioned the amount of money that someone needs to run. So there's a couple things going on. So it's the idea of getting into politics and not getting elected that year and then trying again because and I can see every reason for that. And then for me on the campaign side, like I'm in a much smaller seat, but I feel there's been this campaigning piece that may have been glamorized a little bit, whether it be in television or film or something, but it is not glamorous. It's very hard. And COVID makes it a little different. You're not out campaigning. You're not out meeting people. Maybe it makes it easier. I'm not sure. But it's hard and it's very expensive. So how many hours a day were you devoting to fundraising, like going out and raising money from people?
Well, it depends. In the lieutenant governor's race, I still worked full time and it was very difficult. So I would say I did, as much fundraising as I could. And as it got closer to the general election, I did more. But we ran that entire campaign with a budget of about 1.6 million. And I think I put in $500,000 of my own money. So I really,
Wow.
what I
really got
did was put
behind
in
it.
my own money because I knew I didn't have capacity. We were, as I've mentioned, we do turnaround work for companies that are really struggling. And at the time we were struggling with recapitalizing our company and also the trade wars, the onset of the trade war.
The idea of, people hear 1.6 million, they go, wow, that's a lot. How many people are in the state of Georgia?
10.5 million. So I got
10.5 million. So that is a really good number to come that close to win. I've heard of
votes with $1.6 million. It's extraordinary.
It's extraordinary. So there are Utah has 3 million people, 3.3 in it. And there are congressional races, for the US Congress that are raising 3 times that amount. That's what I want to bring to people's attention. The amount of money that are going into the campaigning only to get people elected when 50-50, someone loses.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? So it was very different in the Senate campaign. I ran for a very specific reason. I had certainly not planned to run again. I actually assumed Stacy would be running for the Senate. And when she told me privately that she wasn't and helped introduce me to some of the national party folks in DC for me to think about it, it was a bit of a surprise. And I was on the fence until our business actually hit some really tough times. So we had been through the trade wars, which started in January of 2018. But we're also very proud to be Teamster. And the Teamsters are part of what's called the Central States Pension Fund. It's a multi-employer pension fund that's managed by an independent board of trustees and has struggled candidly since before I was born. And it's about to collapse in 2024. And that means all of these folks, like my drivers, who've paid into their pension every week,
right,
sometimes for 40 years, and the companies who've paid in right alongside them like we do, they're potentially going to lose everything. It's unclear whether or not the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which is the federal entity that sort of ensures that effectively, or is the backstop for it, is a more accurate way to say it, can survive that hit. And so we were forced into a really painful restructuring in which my family gave up 100% of our equity in the business to save those 3,000 jobs. And it was the only way to restructure the pension obligation so that the business can survive. And I'm grateful we did it. You know, obviously we had no idea COVID was coming, but if we hadn't, the business would never have survived. So right around the time all of this is happening, and by the way, it's not normal to take your company through a restructuring in a bankruptcy and then run for Senate, right? Like that's a tough combination. And I went in eyes wide open.
It's normal now. Yes.
Well, you know, maybe we made it, but for me, in the middle of all of this, the House, led by Democrats, passed a pension relief bill, what's called the Butch-Lewis Act. And it went to the Senate. And like everything else that gets done, from universal background checks to HR 1 protecting our democracy, Mitch McConnell refused to act. He wouldn't even mark it up in committee, let alone debate it or put it on the floor for a vote. And so it sits in the dustbin of Mitch McConnell's office so long as he is the U.S. Senate Majority Leader. And every bit of me that had been on the fence up until that point changed. And I said, I want to be a person who can speak from real world experience about how hard it is to create these good paying union jobs with 100% fully funded health insurance for my employees. And I want to look Mitch McConnell in the eye and say, you are driving an economy where only your wealthy donor class can succeed. And you're doing it at the expense of the people I employ who do everything right. And you're screwing them over. And so I
want to pause you right there.
Right after that.
I want to pause you right there because that is your moment. There's a pivotal moment where you say, you know, I'm going to have a voice in this. I'm actually going to step forward. And that's the moment that I want every American or everybody listening to think that they can have too. It's the moment where you get to say, I'm going to run for I'm going to run for office. I'm going to run for politics. I don't like the way things are going. And that's where we're all qualified. You're born in the United States. That actually gives you the qualification that you need to run for office. So while everybody may have those moments, not everybody stops and raises their hand like you do.
Right. And remember, even if you're not born here, but you become a citizen, you've still got the right to do that.
Right. U.S. citizen, better said.
Absolutely. So it was for me deeply personal. You know, we gave up everything in that business to save jobs and pensions without a single person taking a wage cut or a healthcare cut or losing their pension. You know, there were some folks, I think, that moved from a pension to a different retirement plan in the Teamsters, but we did everything we could. But we were lucky. There are going to be hundreds of businesses that cannot do that as these multi-employer pensions collapse. And meanwhile, the Republicans in the Senate burying their head in the sand. So you know, I wish we had gotten a better outcome in the primary, but I still am hopeful Georgia can pick up not 1, but 2 Senate seats this year for Democrats. And if we flip that majority, and if I had some small part in getting this issue elevated to voters, it was worth everything. I knew I was going to take a beating over the bankruptcy. You know, for those of us who do restructurings for a living, that's just part of what we do to get companies that are desperately in need of help a lifeline. And we did it for all the right reasons. We did it in less than 3 months. The company is now surviving and on its way to great things, thanks to that foresight that we had last year. But I understand the politics of it. I'm not naive. I knew what that would look like, and I knew how it would be.
I think that's where people start. Like, we really have to take our minds out of like, oh, what does my past look like in order to run for office? You know, it's like, it doesn't matter what your past looks like. People have to accept your mistakes. Everything shouldn't come glaringly held against you. Every sentence you've ever said, or every mistake you might have made or decision you've made. It's really about what you're going to do forward or when you get in there. Right. So do you think you'd run again?
Sorry, I should have expected that question. You know, I would never say never. And if I felt like there were a moment like I had last year, right, which was I wanted to elevate the conversation about economic justice for working families. I wanted
Well,
to talk.
I'm pretty sure by next election that may still be lingering out there. So you might be able to get there, right?
Next cycle, probably not. I mean, I'm enjoying this time with my kids. I'm enjoying reflecting on it. I'm enjoying supporting other candidates. I
Well,
started.
and you're doing right. That's my next question. You're on to newer things. You just started a PAC. So in a 30-second, tell everybody what a PAC is.
Yeah, so our political action committee invests in and supports women, progressive women running for state and local office in Georgia. We can write them checks. We can help them with mentorship. We can help them in terms of amplifying their messages. We have our email list, which, after 2 statewide campaigns and some investment on my part is robust. We are using that not only to raise money for the PAC so that the PAC can support these candidates, we're actually asking our donors to give directly to the candidates that we're supporting as well. And so we're using it to elevate the voices of other female candidates in the hopes that changing the inputs into our system will change the outputs. We're specifically focused on candidates that sort of exemplify the American dream. So first generation Americans, first generation college graduates, small business owners, business women, labor leaders, military veterans. And it's been a wonderful experience.
It's really great. And it's called Our American Dreams.
Our
Right?
American Dreams PAC. Yes. And you can go to ouramericandreamspac.com or follow us on Twitter at our_dreams_USA, or me at Sarah Riggs Amico on Twitter, and get all the latest on the PAC and these incredible candidates we're supporting. I could not be more excited about every single one of
I
them.
looked them up. It's amazing. And then you also are a part of Vote Mama, which is a group that supports women who are running for office with children, small children. I also have children, but they're grown-ups. And so Vote Mama is a phenomenal organization that you recently joined.
It is. I'm the state chair for Vote Mama here in Georgia, the first ever state chair. And we support moms with young children, so school-age children, and of course, infants and toddlers running for office. Our founder ran for Congress when she had 2 toddlers and realized how difficult it was for working moms in particular, and for working caregivers and parents generally. But she was actually the mom that petitioned the Federal Elections Commission to let her use federal election campaign funds that she had raised for childcare, and won. And this year, more than 40 candidates across the country, including 4 men, are using that ruling from the FEC to help pay for childcare. The reality is we need more people from working families running for office. And if it's economically prohibitive because they have to leave their job, they can't get childcare, they give up their insurance, we're missing out on a lot of great talent who could help us solve these problems. And childcare right now is an economic crisis in this country.
So I'm always saying, I always talk about raising your hand, getting involved, all of those things. And you are one, you raise your hand every time, and then you back it up by putting your talk and your walk. And is there anything else you shared where people could reach you? Anything else you want to share before we close up today? I completely enjoyed our conversation, by the way.
Well, first and foremost, I want to say thank you, and I have enjoyed it as well. But I would just leave it with this. You're going to have some folks listening trying to figure out what they can do to protect our democracy, to protect their kids' future, and if they should run or if they should volunteer or donate. And I just want to say yes, all of the above. If you're thinking about running, you're qualified. If you've dreamed of running, you're ready. If you have a tug in your heart that says, I don't want to wake up on November 4th knowing I didn't do everything I could to fight for the kind of representative democracy and freedom we enjoy, the time is now. Volunteer, phone bank, text, share on social media, kick in a few bucks to your favorite candidates, or go sign up to run. Because I'm telling you, there's not a one of these guys running that has anything on you. We're all just humans. And the difference is you've got to get your foot in the arena.
That is beautifully said. Thank you so much for being here, Sarah. Completely educational on a grassroots level as to some of the things that happen within politics. And again, reminding everyone, all you have to be is a US citizen in order to vote. And in the meantime, Love your neighbor, regardless of if they're Democratic or Republican. And I'm going to close with a quote that Sarah has actually said, and she said a little bit of it today, but I found this in an article. Nobody should be sick because they're poor or poor because they're sick. We need to protect and sustain the earth. We have an obligation to stand up for economic security and social justice, no matter the color of your skin or who you love. And that is very well said. Thanks everybody for listening. Visit stormysimon.com to read the blog about today's episode. Subscribe to Lunch with Stormy at Apple Podcasts. Leave us 5 stars if you love us. And if you haven't yet, register to vote. And remember that you too can run for office. So do it.